Hello there, my night wanderers. Tonight, beneath the soft glow of a southern moon, we drift into the entire love story of Damon Salvatore and Elena Gilbert. From the very first moment to the very last, every heartbreak, every impossible choice made in the dark. A story of shadows and sacrifice, of the most dangerous man in Mystic Falls, and the girl whose love remade him. So, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the night carry you into one of the bloodiest love stories ever told. A story of shadows and sacrifice, of a dangerous man who walked into a grieving girl's life and changed everything, whether either of them wanted it or not. It begins, as all the best tragedies do, on a bridge. Mystic Falls, Virginia, is a kind of town that looks, at first glance, like it was preserved in amber. The town square with its old colonial buildings, the Founders' Day celebrations, the family names carved into park benches and cemetery headstones, and the cornerstones of buildings that had stood for over a century and a half. It was a town that remembered itself with unusual devotion, that rehearsed its own history every year like a liturgy, that kept its secrets buried so deep beneath the surface of civic pride and sweet tea and high school football that most people who lived there never once suspected the ground beneath their feet was anything other than solid. Elena Gilbert had grown up in that town, shaped by it the way all children are shaped by the particular texture of the place that raised them. She knew which roads flooded in heavy rain and which teachers had been at the high school long enough to have taught her parents. She knew the layout of the cemetery well enough to walk it in darkness, which she sometimes did, because her family had always treated grief as something to be faced rather than avoided. She was, by the time she was 17, a girl who felt things deeply and expressed them carefully. She kept a journal not because she had been told to, but because she had discovered early that the act of writing things down made them more manageable, gave shape to the formless weight of feeling that accumulated inside her if she did not regularly find a way to release it. She loved her family with a quiet intensity that she rarely put into words because she had never needed to. Some things in Mystic Falls were simply understood. Her parents, Grayson and Miranda Gilbert, were the kind of people the community organized itself around without quite realizing it. Grayson was a doctor, steady and methodical, the sort of man who arrived at emergencies already calm, who explained difficult things to frighten people with a patience that never felt performed because it never was. Miranda was warm in the way that made people feel immediately that they had been seen, not just noticed, that the particular fact of their existence had been registered and valued. Elena had her mother's warmth and her father's steadiness, and the combination made her the kind of teenager who somehow managed to be genuinely kind without being naive. She was not someone who mistook niceness for goodness or goodness for safety. She had a spine that most people only discovered when they pushed against it. She also had her brother Jeremy, 4 years younger, and already beginning the particular drift toward trouble that would define much of his adolescence. She had her best friends Bonnie Bennett and Caroline Forbes, one quiet and watchful with gifts she did not yet understand, the other loud and driven and more perceptive beneath the social ambition than most people gave her credit for. She had a life that fit her, a life she had not yet begun to question, a future that seemed to extend forward in reasonable and manageable increments. And then came the night of May 23rd, in the year 2009. Elena went to a party she had not particularly wanted to attend. She was 16 years old. She was tired and had argued with her mother about something small and forgettable, the kind of argument that families have so routinely that no one imagines it could become significant, that no one thinks to memorize. The last conversation, the one that never gets to be finished. Her parents came to collect her from the party when she called, because that was the kind of parents they were, the kind who came when called, regardless of the hour. And they drove home through the dark together with the radio playing low. And whatever tension had existed between Elena and her mother, already dissolving into the comfortable silence of a family that knew how to repair itself. Somewhere on the road that crossed Wickery Bridge, something went wrong. The car went into the water. What happened next was, for a long time, something Elena understood only in fragments. The cold, the dark, the particular silence of water where there should have been air. The way disorientation becomes indistinguishable from surrender when the body has run out of options. Her parents were there, and then they were not. And then someone was pulling her upward through the dark water with a strength that did not feel entirely human. And the surface arrived with a shock of cold night air. And she was lying on the road beside the bridge, and she was breathing, and she was alive, and her parents were not. What she did not know in those first terrible conscious moments on the wet pavement was that the person who had pulled her from the water was not a paramedic, was not a passerby, was not anyone who had any logical reason to be on that road at that hour, or any logical reason to have reached her so quickly, or any logical explanation for the ease with which he had lifted her from the current and carried her to the surface. His name was Damon Salvatore. He was 173 years old. He had been a vampire since 1864, turned during the chaos of the Civil War in a moment of betrayal so complete and so intimate that it had not merely wounded him, but had reorganized everything he was, had taken the person he had been before and replaced him with something harder and colder and far more dangerous. He had loved a woman named Catherine Pierce with the absolute and consuming devotion of a young man who had never been taught that some loves are designed to destroy you. She had turned him and his brother Stefan into vampires and then vanished, allowing both of them to believe she had burned to death in a church while Confederate soldiers sealed the doors, allowing them to carry the grief of her loss for 145 years, while she moved freely through the world, unbothered and utterly unrepentant. Damon had spent those 145 years in the particular way of someone who has decided that caring about anything is a luxury he he can no longer afford. He moved, he fed, he did what he wanted and took what he pleased and answered to no one, because the last time he had answered to someone, that someone had used his devotion as a tool and discarded him without a second thought. He was not, by the time he returned to Mystic Falls, a good man. He would have been the first to confirm this and the last to apologize for it. He'd come back to Mystic Falls that September night not for Elena, not for any noble purpose. He had come back for Catherine, or for the idea of Catherine, for the century-old wound that had never properly closed, and that he had decided, in the particular way of people who have run out of other options, to finally address. He believed Catherine was sealed beneath the old Fells Church, trapped in a tomb along with other vampires from the 1864 massacre. He had a plan, and he had a reason, and neither of them had anything to do with a 16-year-old girl on a bridge. And yet, when he heard the car go into the water, when he was close enough to the bridge to hear the impact and the splash, and then the terrible silence that followed, he had gone in after her without thinking. Because even then, even at his most deliberately careless, something in him still moved toward the drowning. It was a reflex that surprised even him. In the half-second between hearing and acting, he did not examine it. He simply moved. He pulled her to the surface. He carried her to the road. He laid her down on the wet pavement and looked at her face, and every thought in his mind stopped. She had Catherine's face, not similar to Catherine's face, not reminiscent of it, identical, down to the line of the jaw and the particular set of the eyes and the dark hair plastered wet against pale skin. For one disorienting moment the world tilted on his axis, and Damon Salvatore, who had not been genuinely surprised by anything in decades, stood absolutely still on a dark Virginia road and simply stared. Then she opened her eyes, and the moment passed, because the eyes were wrong. Not the color, not the shape, but the expression behind them. Catherine Pierce's eyes, even in vulnerability, even in what passed for her most unguarded moments, always held something behind them. A calculation, an awareness of effect, a subtle and perpetual consciousness of the impression she was making and the use to which it could be put. Even her suffering had always been, on some level, a performance. The girl on the road had none of that. She looked up at him with an expression of pure and unmediated shock, the kind of shock that has no room left in it for anything but itself. And then the shock gave way to grief so raw and immediate and completely undefended that Damon felt it land in his chest like something physical. She was not performing. She was not calculating. She was simply a girl who had just lost her parents and was lying on a road in the dark and had not yet begun to understand the full weight of what had just happened to her. He compelled her. It was the obvious and necessary thing to do. He could not allow her to remember him, could not allow a human witness to his presence on that road at that hour. He looked into those dark eyes, and he told her that she had not seen him, that she would not remember him, that the paramedics and the emergency workers who were already on their way would be the ones she recalled when she thought about this night. But before he let the compulsion settle fully, before he stepped back into the tree line and allowed the darkness to close around him, something made him pause. He looked at her face one more time, at that expression of open, unguarded grief that Catherine would never have allowed herself. at the particular quality of her presence, the way she was entirely herself in this moment, entirely real, without armor or agenda. "You want a love that consumes you," he said quietly, his voice low and even, almost gentle in a way that would have surprised anyone who knew him. "You want passion and adventure and even a little danger." He paused. The sound of distant sirens was beginning to reach them, faint but growing. "You deserve a love that is epic." He stepped back into the trees before she could respond, before she could do anything with the words except let them settle into the part of her that the compulsion could not quite reach. He moved through the darkness with the silence of long practice, putting distance between himself and the bridge, between himself and the girl on the road, between himself and whatever that moment had been. He did not examine why those particular words had risen in him. He did not ask himself what it meant that he had thought, even briefly, about what she deserved. He filed the encounter away in the same place he filed most things that did not fit his understanding of himself and kept moving. Elena Gilbert did not remember him. She lay on the road, and she was found by the paramedics who arrived 4 minutes later, and she was taken to the hospital, and she began the long and terrible process of surviving the unsurvivable. She moved through the following weeks in the specific fog of early grief, managing it with the quiet steadiness that was her nature, holding herself together for Jeremy, who was unraveling loudly and needed her steadiness to anchor against. She held herself together for Aunt Jenna, who had arrived to care for them both with genuine love and genuine uncertainty in approximately equally measure. She wrote in her journal every night, not because it helped exactly, but because it was the only place she knew how to be entirely honest. She wrote that she felt like she had been cut loose from something, that without her parents watching, without the specific gravity of their love orienting her, she was not entirely certain who she was or what direction she was supposed to be moving in. She did not write this as complaint or self-pity. She wrote it as observation, as the kind of careful accounting of inner weather that had always been her way of understanding herself. She did not know that several miles away, in the town her family had lived in for generations, a man was settling back into the shadows of a place that held his oldest wounds. She did not know that he had already seen her face, that he had already, in some wordless and unexamined way, made a choice about her before she even knew he existed. She did not know that the words he had spoken over her on a dark road would eventually find their way back to her, that she would one day understand what they had meant and who had said them and at what cost. She sat in her room on a September evening and opened her journal and wrote that she had decided to choose happiness, that she was going to try, that she was going to step back into her life and see whether it still fit. She did not know that the next morning she would walk into a cemetery and meet a boy with kind eyes and an old sadness, and that somewhere in the same town, that boy's brother was already carrying her face in his memory, like a question he had not yet decided to answer. The story she thought was ending had not yet begun, and the man she did not know existed had already, without permission, without intention, without any of the defenses he had spent 145 years constructing, begun to fall. The cemetery sat at the edge of town the way cemeteries always do, at the place where the living and the dead agree to exist, in close proximity, without making too much of it. Elena went there the morning after she wrote in her journal about choosing happiness, not because she was looking for anything in particular, but because it was one of the places that had always made sense to her. The quiet rows of headstones, the old trees, the particular quality of stillness that accumulated in spaces where people came to remember. She was sitting on a bench near the older section, the part of the cemetery where the headstones bore dates from the 1800s, when she became aware that she was not alone. He was standing a few rows away, looking at one of the older graves with an expression she recognized immediately, even on a stranger's face. It was the expression of someone who had known loss and had learned to carry it without advertising it, the particular stillness of grief that has been lived with long enough to become something quieter than acute pain. His name was Stefan Salvatore. He was tall and dark-haired and possessed of the kind of measured calm that Elena, who had her father's steadiness, instinctively recognized and trusted. He looked up when he sensed her watching, and did not seem embarrassed to have been caught in a private moment, which she found she respected. "Sorry," Elena said. "I didn't mean to stare. I just didn't expect anyone else to be here this early." "Don't apologize," Stefan said quietly. "I find it easier to come when it's quiet, before the rest of the world starts up." She understood that completely. "Me too," she said, and something in the simplicity of that exchange settled between them like an agreement. They did not speak for long that first morning, but something passed between them in that cemetery that Elena would spend the next several days trying to name, a sense of recognition that had no logical basis, the feeling of meeting someone you have somehow already been waiting for without knowing it. Stefan enrolled at Mystic Falls High School the following week. He was there, he explained, because his guardian, his Uncle Zach, lived in town. He was quiet in class and careful in conversation, choosing his words with an attention that felt neither guarded nor calculated, but simply deliberate, the way some people are deliberate because they understand the weight that words can carry. He found his way into Eleanor's orbit gradually and without apparent effort, sitting near her at lunch, falling into step beside her in the hallway, listening to her with a quality of attention she had not realized she had been missing until she encountered it. Eleanor, who had spent the months since her parents' deaths going through the careful motions of her own recovery, felt something loosen in her chest in Stefan's company. He did not treat her like he was fragile. He did not look at her with the particular mixture of sympathy and discomfort that most people have been directing at her since the accident. He simply looked at her as if she were herself, as if the grief was part of her but not the whole of her, and that straightforward recognition was, in the specific context of her particular loneliness, an extraordinary gift. "You don't look at me like I'm broken," she told him one afternoon, and immediately wondered if she should not have said it. Stefan considered this with the seriousness it deserved, rather than deflecting it with reassurance. "You're not broken," he said. "You're just someone who's been through something real. There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. "Most people don't see it that way. Most people are uncomfortable with grief," he said simply. "So they project fragility onto the person carrying it. It's easier than sitting with them in it. Elena was quiet for a moment after that, turning the words over. "You sound like someone who knows," she said finally. "I do," Stefan said, and left it at that. And she did not push, because she recognized a closed door when she saw one and understood, better than most, the right to keep certain rooms private. She did not know, in those early weeks, that Stefan had come to Mystic Falls because of her, that he had seen a photograph and been pulled back to the town of his birth by the face of a girl who looked exactly like a woman he had loved and lost 145 years ago. She did not know that the measured calm she found so reassuring was partly the discipline of a vampire who had spent decades learning to control instincts that could destroy everything he touched. She did not know any of the things about Stefan Salvatore that would have, by any reasonable measure, sent her running. What she knew was simpler and more immediate. She knew that when she was with him, the fog of grief lifted slightly, enough for her to breathe. That was not nothing. In the autumn following the worst night of her life, that was very nearly everything. And then Damon arrived. He did not arrive quietly. Damon Salvatore had not done anything quietly in 145 years, and he saw no reason to begin now. He appeared in Mystic Falls like a weather system, all surface charm and underlying violence. Beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things are beautiful, the way a lit match is beautiful, the way the moment just before a storm breaks is beautiful. He wore his confidence like armor and his cruelty like a weapon, and he walked into every room as if he had already assessed it and found it beneath him. Elena met him for the first time at the Salvatore boarding house, and the meeting was nothing like her first encounter with Stefan. Where Stefan had been careful and measured, Damon was immediate and overwhelming, filling the space around him with an energy that demanded response. He looked at her with eyes that were very blue and very knowing, and he smiled at her with a smile that did not quite reach those eyes, and she understood within approximately 30 seconds of meeting him that he was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the supernatural. "So you're the one Stefan's been hiding," he said, looking her over with a frankness that was clearly designed to unsettle her. "I'm not hidden," Elena said evenly. "I just haven't had a reason to come by until now." Something shifted in his expression at that, brief and quickly suppressed, but she caught it. He had expected a different response. Flattery perhaps, or discomfort. Not a clean and immediate refusal to engage on his terms. "I like her," he said, turning slightly towards Stefan, as if Elena were not standing directly in front of him. "She has spine. You always did have good taste, brother. In some things." The last two words carried something beneath them, something old and sharp, and Elena watched Stefan's jaw tighten fractionally and filed the observation away. There was history between these two that went far beyond ordinary sibling friction. It was the kind of history that left marks. In the weeks that followed, Damon inserted himself into the fabric of Mystic Falls with deliberate and calculated ease. He attended founders' events with the air of someone performing a joke only he fully understood, charming the council members with effortless grace, while doing precisely what he pleased the moment their backs were turned. Elena watched him the way she watched most things she did not yet understand, carefully and from a slight distance, and what she saw troubled her in ways she found difficult to articulate. He was not what he performed. That much was obvious. The surface of Damon Salvatore, all easy smiles and cutting wit and magnificent indifference, was a construction. Beneath it, there was something else, something she could not name yet, that occasionally surfaced in the gaps between his performances before the mask came back up. And he was doing real damage. He had taken to Caroline with a possessiveness that had nothing tender in it, feeding from her and compelling her and leaving her confused and diminished in ways that made Elena's fury rise sharp and immediate. Every time she noticed the bruises Caroline tried to conceal with careful makeup, the gaps in her memory she laughed off with decreasing conviction. Elena found Damon alone in the Salvatore parlor one evening and did not give herself time to reconsider. "You need to stop," she said. "What you're doing to Caroline, you need to stop." Damon turned from the window with an expression of elaborate unconcern. "Caroline and I have an understanding." "Caroline doesn't understand anything right now because you won't let her," Elena said. "That's not an understanding. That's a cage." "You're very passionate about people who aren't you," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Has anyone ever told you that's a dangerous quality? Has anyone ever told you that cruelty isn't the same thing as strength?" she returned. He was quiet for a moment, which she was learning to recognize as unusual. Damon generally had a response to everything. "You can't keep doing this," Elena continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "Using people, hurting people, and then smiling like it's all a game." "Why do you care?" he said finally. And there was something different in the question, something beneath the performance that was almost genuine. "I'm the villain, Elena. Villains don't take notes from the audience. I care because Caroline is my friend," she said, "and because someone should say it to your face instead of behind your back. You're better than this." The last sentence surprised even her as she said it. She was not certain it was true, but something in his expression in the silence that followed suggested it had landed somewhere undefended, somewhere the armor did not fully cover. "You don't know what I am," he said, and his voice had lost some of its performance quality, had become flatter and more honest. "No," Elena agreed quietly, "but I'm starting to." She left him standing there and did not look back, and she told herself the conversation had been about Caroline, and only about Caroline. Stefan noticed the dynamic developing with the perceptiveness of someone who had spent a very long time watching humans, and he saw the way Eleanor's attention moved toward Damon, even when she was actively choosing to look somewhere else. He said nothing about it, because there was nothing yet to say. Eleanor was with him. Whatever complicated attention she paid to his brother was something he recognized, but could not address without making it larger than it yet was. Damon noticed differently. He noticed that she looked at him not with attraction, at least not primarily, but with assessment. She was trying to understand him, not to fix him, not to save him, but simply because she was a person who could not leave a thing unexamined, and he was a puzzle whose solution interested her for no practical reason whatsoever. No one had been genuinely interested in Damon Salvatore, as opposed to his performance, in a very long time. Catherine had looked at him and seen usefulness. Stefan looked at him and saw history and harm in approximately equal measure. The people of Mystic Falls looked at him and saw charm, or danger, or both. Elena looked at him and seemed to see something else entirely, something she had not yet named and he could not yet identify. And the fact of that unnamed thing sat in him like an ember he could not quite bring himself to extinguish, because the more he was around her, the less she resembled Catherine. Not in face, never in face, but in everything that actually mattered. She did not manipulate. She did not calculate her warmth or ration her honesty based on what it would return to her. She argued with him not to win, but because she meant what she was saying. Catherine had never once in her life said something simply because she believed it. He did not say any of this. He did not examine it more closely than necessary. But on a night in early October, when Elena had gone home and Stefan had gone hunting and the boarding house was quiet, Damon stood at the window with a glass of bourbon he was not drinking and looked out at the dark town he had been born in and died in and kept returning to, and understood with a particular clarity that comes right before a person stops being able to lie to themselves that he was in a kind of trouble he had not been in for a very long time. He thought, briefly and against his will, about a dark road and a bridge and a girl with wet hair lying on the pavement looking up at him with eyes that had no calculation in them whatsoever. He poured the bourbon down the sink. He went to bed, or what passed for it. He almost did not think about her again until morning. Almost. The tomb beneath Fell's Church had been sealed for 145 years. Damon had spent most of those years organizing his existence around the certainty of what was inside it. Catherine Pierce, trapped with 26 other vampires when the founding families of Mystic Falls had rounded them up and burned the church above their heads, preserved by a spell cast by the witch Emily Bennett, waiting in the dark for the moment someone who loved her enough would find a way to open the door and bring her back into the light. That someone, in Damon's accounting, was him, had always been him. The entire architecture of his return to Mystic Falls, the grimoire, the comet, the careful and ruthless manipulation of Bonnie Bennett's emerging powers, all of it had been constructed in service of this single purpose. He had spent a century and a half being the kind of person who did not care about consequences because the only thing he cared about was on the other side of a sealstone door beneath an old ruined church. He had built his entire immortal existence around that door, around what was behind it, around her. He had loved Catherine Pierce the way young men love catastrophically, with the absolute and unexamined totality of someone who does not yet know that some loves are designed to consume rather than sustain. She had been everything to him in 1864, the center of gravity around which his entire world had organized itself. And when she had disappeared into what he believed was fire and ash and death, the grief of it had not softened over time the way human grief eventually softens. It had calcified. It had become structural, load-bearing, the thing that held up every other decision he had made in 145 years of being something other than human. He got the tomb open in February, in the cold dark beneath the ruins of the church, with Bonnie's reluctant help and the last of Emily's channeled power. Catherine was not inside it. He stood in the stone chamber and understood this with a quality of stillness that was different from every other kind of stillness he had practiced. The other vampires were there, desiccated and starving and immediately dangerous, dragging themselves toward the entrance with the desperate urgency of the very long imprisoned. But Catherine was not among them. She had never been among them. She had escaped the fire in 1864 and walked out of Mystic Falls under her own power, free and unbothered, and she had simply never come back, had never sent word, had never, in 145 years, done anything to indicate that the man who had become a vampire for her, who had let that transformation define every subsequent decade of his existence, was worth a single moment of her consideration. The founding families had not killed her. The fire had not taken her. Time had not touched her. She had simply decided, with the casual efficiency that Elena would later recognize as quintessentially Catherine, that Damon Salvatore was not worth the inconvenience of a return trip. Elena found him afterward. She had not been meant to be there, but she had been involved in enough of the tomb's unraveling to understand what had happened. And when she arrived at the Salvatore boarding house and found him sitting in the parlor in the dark with a stillness that was entirely unlike his usual performed composure, she understood immediately that something fundamental had given way. She sat down across from him without being invited. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. The bourbon on the table beside him was untouched. She wasn't there, he said. It was not a question. It was a man saying a true thing out loud for the first time, testing the weight of it in the open air. No, Elena said quietly. She wasn't. He laughed, and it was the worst sound she had ever heard him make, emptier than his cruelty and more honest than anything else he had offered her in all the months she had known him. 145 years, he said, and the words came out with a flatness that was somehow more devastating than anguish would have been. She was never even in the room. Eleanor was quiet, sitting with that, not rushing to fill the silence with reassurance he would not have believed, and she was not certain she could honestly offer. "I'm sorry," she said finally, and she meant it without qualification, which he could tell, which made it simultaneously worse and more bearable. "Don't be," he said, reaching reflexively for the familiar armor. "It's pathetic. I spent a century and a half chasing a ghost who didn't bother to haunt me back. You're allowed to think it's pathetic." "I think it's sad," Elena said evenly. "There's a difference. Pathetic is what you call something to dismiss it. Sad is just what it is." He looked at her across the dim room, and the performance was entirely absent from his face in that moment, stripped away by exhaustion and the specific devastation of discovering that the story you have been telling yourself about your own life is not the story that was actually happening. "Why are you here?" he asked, and the question was genuine in a way his questions rarely were. He was not deflecting. He was actually asking. "Because you shouldn't be alone right now," Elena said. "And because Stefan doesn't always know how to be with you when you're like this. He loves you, but the two of you have too much history between you to sit quietly in a room together without it getting complicated." She paused. "I don't have that history. I can just be here." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she could not fully name. Something that might have been gratitude, or might have been the precursor to gratitude. Something that had not yet decided whether it was safe to exist. "You're a strange person, Elena Gilbert," he said finally. "I know," she said, and the faint humor in her voice was exactly calibrated to the moment, enough to ease it without dismissing it. He did not tell her to leave. She stayed until the fire went fully cold, and when she finally rose to go, neither of them remarked upon the fact that something had shifted in the room that could not be shifted back. The weeks that followed the tomb revelation reorganized something in Damon that he would not have been able to name precisely, but that Elena could observe in small and accumulating ways. He did not become good. That was not the nature of the shift, and anyone expecting that transformation would have been quickly and thoroughly disappointed. He remained capable of violence and manipulation, and the particular brand of casual cruelty that had defined his first months in Mystic Falls. He was still dangerous. He was still Damon. But there were gaps in it now, fissures in the performance, where something that might, under the right conditions, become genuine consideration occasionally surfaced, and those moments clustered. Eleanor noticed with an attention she did not fully interrogate around her. He listened to her when she pushed back. Not always, and not without argument, but he listened in a way that suggested her opinion had registered and was being processed rather than simply discarded. He appeared at the right moments with a reliability that could not entirely be explained by self-interest. He said things that were true when he could have said things that were easier, not out of kindness exactly, but out of the particular respect he had for her refusal to be managed. The Miss Mystic Falls pageant arrived in April with all its small-town ceremony and barely concealed social architecture. Caroline, who treated civic institutions with the seriousness of someone who understood that community rituals matter precisely because they are shared, had nominated Elena, and Elena had agreed with the grace of someone picking battles wisely. She had a partner for the dance portion of the afternoon. That partner was Stefan, except Stefan did not appear. He had been struggling for weeks with something Elena understood in outline but not in detail. The control he maintained over his vampire nature required a vigilance that was enormous and unrelenting, and something had been eroding that control. Some combination of proximity to blood and old darkness, and the particular strain of loving Elena while carrying secrets large enough to destabilize everything. On the afternoon of the Miss Mystic Falls pageant, Stefan was somewhere in the woods outside town, losing a battle she could not help him fight because she did not yet fully understand what the battle was. Damon appeared at her elbow with a glass of water and the careful neutrality she had come to recognize as one of his more honest expressions, the face he wore when he was about to do something he wouldn't want examined too closely. "He's not coming," Damon said. "I know," Elena said, because she had already felt it, that particular absence. "I'll do it," he said. Not an offer precisely, a statement of fact leaving room for objection. She looked at him steadily. "You know how to waltz." "I was born in 18 Elena. I was taught to dance before I was taught to read. It was considered a more essential skill." She almost smiled despite the complicated weight of the afternoon. "All right," she said. What followed was one of those moments that resist straightforward description, because what made it significant was not any single element, but the accumulation of all of them together. They took their place among the other couples, and the music began. And Damon danced with her the way people danced in 1818, with complete attention, with a physical awareness of his partner that was neither aggressive nor apologetic, but simply present and unhurried. The awareness of someone for whom this kind of proximity required no performance because it was simply natural. Eleni found herself following him with an ease that should not have existed given everything she knew about him, given the careful wariness she had maintained since the first night she had met him in the boarding house and understood within 30 seconds that he was someone to be watched. The ease was not naivety. It was something else, something she did not examine during the dance itself, because examining it would have required stopping, and she found, with a clarity that surprised her, that she did not want to stop. They did not speak during the dance. The choreography did not require it, and something in the quality of the silence between them suggested that words would have been a reduction of whatever was actually happening. There was a conversation occurring nonetheless, conducted entirely in the language of attention and proximity, and the particular awareness of another person that bypasses the rational mind entirely and registers somewhere older and less manageable. When the music ended and they separated to the appropriate distance, and the crowd applauded with the pleasant enthusiasm of people who have witnessed something genuinely graceful, Elena did not look at Damon for a long moment. She looked out at the green and the other couples and the cheerful ordinary surface of a Mystic Falls afternoon, and she felt the shape of what had just happened settling into her understanding, like something that would take time to fully process. When she did look at him, his face was the most unguarded she had seen it. Not open exactly. Damon's face was rarely fully open, but unguarded in the sense that the usual architecture of deflection had temporarily come down, and what was underneath it was simply a person who had just experienced something real and had not yet had time to decide how to perform, not caring about it. He looked away first, which was, she thought later, the most telling thing of all. Jeremy's near death arrived in May without sufficient warning, the way the worst things tend to arrive. He'd been spending time with Anna, the young vampire whose own entanglement with the tomb had drawn her into the Mystic Falls orbit, and he had made a decision that came from the particular combination of adolescent grief and supernatural proximity that Mystic Falls seemed to produce in vulnerable people with devastating regularity. He had taken Anna's blood. He had acquired vervain. The shape of his intention was clear enough to anyone paying attention. Damon was paying attention. He made the calculation quickly and with the internal logic that governed most of his worst decisions. The conviction that a swift and brutal intervention now prevented a catastrophic and irreversible one later. He found Jeremy, and he snapped his neck with the efficient speed of someone who has decided that efficiency is the same thing as mercy. Elena arrived at the Salvatore house within the hour. She had been called. She had come. And what she brought with her was not the measured anger of their earlier confrontations, but something raw and more fundamental, the fury of someone whose family had been touched. "You killed him," she said, and her voice was shaking, not with tears, but with a specific frequency of anger that has grief directly beneath it, close enough to the surface that the two were barely distinguishable. "He had vampire blood in his system," Damon said, and his voice was flat with the particular flatness of someone delivering a logical argument, while understanding that logic is not what the moment requires. "He'll wake up human. The blood will pass through his system, and he'll be fine, and this will be over. That was not your choice to make. The words came out with a precision that was more devastating than volume would have been. That was Jeremy's life, his decision, his future. You do not get to decide that for him. I was preventing him from making a decision he could not take back. By making an irreversible decision yourself, she said. Do you hear yourself? You snapped my brother's neck to save him from a choice, and you did it without asking him, without asking me, without asking anyone, because you decided you knew best. That is not protection, Damon. That is control. There's a difference. He was quiet. The room was very still. You keep doing this, she continued, and her voice was quieter now, but no less steady. Every time something matters, every time there is a real moment between us, a real possibility of something, you reach for the most destructive option available, and you call it pragmatism. You blew up the moment on the porch. You hurt Caroline. Now this. She stopped, gathering herself. You cannot keep doing that and expect people to stay close to you. Eventually everyone leaves, and you will have made sure of it yourself. The silence that followed was long enough to have weight. I know, he said finally. 2 words entirely stripped of performance, carrying only their plain meaning. Elena looked at him for a moment longer, and what was in her expression was not softness exactly, but something adjacent to it, the look of someone who sees a person clearly, damage and all, and has not yet decided what to do with what they see. She left without saying anything else, and the sound of the door closing was very quiet, which was somehow worse than if she had slammed it. The road trips that followed in the coming weeks were born of necessity rather than choice. Damon and Elena moving through small Virginia towns in pursuit of information, protection, pieces of the larger supernatural puzzle that Mystic Falls kept generating faster than any of them could solve it. They drove with the radio low and argued about everything with the particular freedom of people who have already seen each other at their worst and have not yet decided how much that matters. She called him out when he was performing. He pushed back when she was pretending to be more certain than she was. The arguments were honest in a way that their more careful conversations never quite managed, and in the honesty there was something that functioned increasingly like intimacy. In a diner outside Richmond, rain against, the windows and bad coffee going cold between them, Damon looked at her in the quiet after an argument had run its course, and his expression had none of its usual construction in it. Elena looked back. The distance between them became the kind of distance that requires a conscious decision to maintain. She made the decision. She looked down at her coffee cup. She said something about the drive home, and the moment passed, and they paid the bill and went back to the car and drove through the rain without addressing what had just almost happened. But it had existed. They both carried the knowledge of it home, separately and without discussion, like something fragile that neither of them was ready to set down in the light where it could be properly examined. On the porch of her house, before she went inside, Damon stood in the dark with the expression he wore when he had decided to do something he would immediately regret. "I love you, Elena," he said, and the words were completely undefended, offered without irony or deflection or any of the armor he had spent decades perfecting. She turned to look at him. His face was entirely open in a way she had never seen it, and the openness of it was more frightening than his cruelty had ever been because it was real. It was simply, plainly, devastatingly real. Then something shifted behind his eyes, a decision being made in real time. He stepped forward and pressed 2 fingers gently to her temple, and his voice, when he spoke, was very quiet and very careful. "And because I love you," he said, "I need you to forget I said that." He compelled her. He gave her the truest thing he had and removed it in the same breath, because he believed with the exhausted certainty of someone who's been wrong about the most important things for a very long time, that she was better without it, that Stefan was what she deserved, that he was not the kind of thing you handed to someone you were trying to protect. Elena went inside. She did not remember what had been said on the porch. She went to bed and slept without knowing that someone had just offered her the most honest moment of their long and complicated existence, and then quietly taken it back because they were certain the gift would do her more harm than the silence. Damon walked home through the dark and did not examine what he had just done or why, because examining it would have required admitting that the choice to erase the words had hurt him more than saying them had. He had spent 145 years making sure he was alone. He was beginning to understand, slowly and against his will, that he was no longer entirely certain it was what he wanted. Catherine Pierce came back to Mystic Falls in the autumn of the 2nd year, like a match dropped into dry grass. And everything that had been carefully constructed in her absence began, immediately and almost elegantly, to burn. She arrived without announcement and without apology, which was consistent with everything she had ever done. She wore Eleanor's face the way she had always worn everything, as a tool, as a weapon, as a surface behind which the actual calculation could proceed unobserved. She moved through the town with the confidence of someone who had never once in 500 years been made to feel that her presence required justification, and she reinserted herself into the lives of the Salvatore brothers with the casual precision of a person who understands exactly which wounds have never fully closed. Elena encountered her own face in a hotel corridor and experienced the particular vertigo of a person confronting something that should be impossible. Catherine looked at her with eyes that wore her features and held nothing of her interior, none of the warmth or the openness or the refusal to calculate, and smiled with a quality of amusement that made Eleanor understand in her bones the difference between resemblance and identity. "You've been very busy," Catherine said, her voice carrying the slight cadence of an older accent beneath the contemporary surface. Centuries of movement compressed into something that was almost, but not quite, Elena's own inflection. Both of them. That's either impressive or reckless. I haven't decided which. "I'm not you," Elena said. "No," Catherine agreed pleasantly. "You're not. That's what makes this interesting." She walked away, and Elena stood in the corridor and felt a specific chill of understanding that the woman who had shaped the last 2 years of her life, without ever being present in them, had just introduced herself, and that nothing would be uncomplicated again. Catherine moved through both brothers with the efficiency of someone who had spent 5 centuries perfecting the particular art of using love as leverage. She found Stefan first, and what she told him was delivered with the precise cruelty of someone who knows exactly where the oldest wounds are located. She had never loved him. She said it plainly, without evident remorse, in the way you state a fact rather than confess a failing. She had used him in 1864 because he was useful, and because Damon's devotion had required a counterweight, and because she had never, not once, made decisions based on what they would cost other people. Stefan had loved her with everything he had, and she had accepted that love as a resource rather than a gift, and she wanted him to know this now because the knowing would make him easier to manage. Stefan received this information with the stillness of someone who has suspected a thing for a long time and is experiencing the grim and nauseating relief of having the suspicion confirmed. It did not destroy him, because Stefan Salvatore had been destroyed before and had learned, at considerable cost, how to survive it. But it reorganized something in him, settled something that had been unresolved, and Elena watched the aftermath of it with the particular helplessness of someone who loves a person they cannot protect from their own history. What Catherine told Damon was different in content and identical in intent. She had always loved him. This was the version she offered Damon, delivered with a full arsenal of her considerable skill at performing sincerity, her eyes holding his with an expression of something that was designed to look like longing. She had always loved him. He was the one she had chosen, the one she had thought about through a century and a half of absence, the one who had never left her mind. Damon listened. Elena, who was not present for this conversation, but would piece it together from fragments over the following days, understood what it must have cost him to hear it, and what it must have cost him more to begin the process of not believing it. Because part of him wanted to believe it. Of course, part of him did. The architecture of 145 years of devotion does not dismantle itself simply because the object of that devotion has been revealed as something other than what was imagined. The heart is not rational in its restructuring. It holds on even when the hands have let go. But Damon had sat in a dark parlour in February and understood that Catherine had never been in the tomb. He had sat with that knowledge in the presence of Elena Gilbert, who had not offered him absolution, but had simply stayed, and something in that experience had shifted the foundation in a way that Catherine's return could not entirely reverse. He was watching her now with different eyes than he would have used a year earlier, noticing the calculation behind the warmth, noticing the way her attention moved when she thought no one was observing it, always assessing, always measuring, always oriented toward advantage rather than toward the person in front of her. He had loved Catherine for so long that her particular qualities had become invisible to him through familiarity, but absence had given him distance, and Elena had given him a comparison he had not asked for and could not now set aside. Catherine was everything Elena was not, which was not, in itself, a revelation, but the weight of it was different now. The contrast had accumulated meaning. The sacrificial ritual surrounding the Aztec curse, which was not in fact an Aztec curse but something considerably older and more specifically targeted, required the doppelganger. It required Elena, Klaus, the original hybrid, whose existence had been a rumor and a myth in vampire circles for millennia, was real and was coming, and what he needed for the ritual that would break his hybrid curse was a list of components that included moonstone and a werewolf and a vampire and a witch and Elena's blood, and ultimately, Elena's death. The knowledge settled over the group in the boarding house, with the weight of something that changes the quality of every subsequent moment. Elena would die. The ritual required it. Klaus was not a negotiable entity, not someone who could be reasoned with or redirected, not someone whose requirements could be substituted or satisfied through alternatives. He was the most powerful creature any of them had encountered, and he wanted Elena. And that fact became the organizing principle of everything that followed. Damon's response to this information was immediate and characteristic. He was not going to allow it. The determination was not tactical in its origin, was not a calculation about the greater good or the optimal strategy. It was simply refusal, absolute and non-negotiable. The refusal of someone who has identified the one thing they will not accept and is prepared to dismantle everything else to prevent it. "There has to be another way," he said, in the Salvatore parlor with the others gathered around the problem, like it was something that could be solved by proximity and sufficient attention. "There isn't," Elijah said, and Elijah was someone whose 1,000 years of existence lent his certainty a weight that was difficult to argue against. The ritual requires the doppelganger's blood. It requires her death. That is the nature of what Klaus intends. "Then we change what Klaus intends," Damon said. "You cannot change what Klaus intends," Elijah said, with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who understands it perfectly well and is refusing to accept it. "You can only survive it or not." Elena, who had been listening from the doorway, entered the room fully. "Then we survive it," she said. "We find a way to survive it. We do what we have to do, and we figure out how to bring me back." Damon looked at her with an expression that was not anger, though it would have been easier if it were. It was something more difficult, the expression of someone confronting the possibility of a world without a specific person in it, and finding that the world in question becomes, in that contemplation, essentially unimaginable. The werewolf bite came before the sacrifice did. Tyler Crowley, newly turned and imperfectly controlled, caught Damon in a moment of defensive struggle, and the bite that marked his arm in mid-spring began the process that everyone who knew vampire lore understood was a death sentence. Werewolf venom had no cure. It moved through the vampire bloodstream with systematic efficiency, inducing fever and hallucination, and an accelerating deterioration that ended, always, in death. Damon did not tell Elena immediately. This was consistent with his character, the instinct to manage information, to maintain the performance of control, even when control was slipping. He continued to move through the days with his usual surface energy, and if the surface was slightly more frantic than usual, if the charm had an edge of something desperate beneath it, most people attributed it to the pressure of the situation with Klaus and did not look more closely. Elena looked more closely. She always did. She found him in his room on a Thursday afternoon, the curtains drawn against the May sunlight, his face sheened with sweat that should not have been possible for a vampire, his eyes carrying the particular brightness of a fever that was beyond what his body should have been generating. The bite on his arm was darkening at the edges, the veins around it visible in a way that was not natural. She sat beside him on the bed without being invited, which was her consistent practice with him by now. The quiet insistence on presence that he had long since stopped pretending to resent. "How long?" she asked. He looked at her with eyes that were, in the fever's erosion of his usual defenses, entirely unguarded. "Few days," he said. "Maybe less." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this with a steadiness that was her nature, the refusal to fall apart when falling apart was least useful. "We'll find something," she said. "Elena." "We will find something," she said again, and her voice carried the particular quality of determination that was not optimism, but was something more durable than optimism. The refusal to accept the stated terms of a situation before every alternative had been exhausted. He laughed quietly, and it hurt him, and she saw that it hurt him, and she did not look away. As the fever deepened over the following hours, the hallucinations began. Damon drifted between clarity and a state that was something between dream and delirium, his mind producing the particular visions of someone whose defenses have been fully stripped away. In those unguarded intervals he spoke, not always coherently, not always to the person actually present in the room, but with an honesty that was only available to him because he could not maintain the performance. He believed in one of those intervals that Elena was Catherine. He looked at her with eyes that were somewhere between the present and a place she could not follow, and he spoke to the face he had carried in his memory for a century and a half. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I'm not what you wanted. I know I was always too much and not enough at the same time. I'm sorry I couldn't be whatever it was that would have made you stay." Elena sat very still. "I'm selfish," he continued, his voice rough with fever and with something older than fever. "I know that. I've always known that. I took what I wanted, and I told myself the wanting justified the taking, and there were people who got hurt because of that, and I just kept going." He paused, his eyes unfocused. "I don't know how to be different. I've been trying, and I don't know if I'm doing it right." "Damon," she said softly. He focused on her, and something shifted in his expression, a recognition assembling itself through the fever. "You're not Catherine," he said. "No," Elena said. "I'm not." He looked at her for a long moment with the specific expression of someone who is seeing something clearly for the first time, not because the thing has changed, but because everything that was obscuring it has been temporarily removed. "You never are," he said quietly. "That used to bother me. It doesn't anymore." She reached out and took his hand, her warm fingers closing around his, and she stayed with him through the night, while the fever climbed and the venom continued its systematic work. And she did not leave even when it would have been easier to leave, because Elena Gilbert did not leave people in the dark if she could help it. Stefan made the deal with Klaus. He surrendered his sobriety, his hard-won decades of control over the Ripper that lived inside him, in exchange for the cure that only Klaus's blood could provide. He did it without telling Elena first, which she would struggle with for a long time afterward. The knowledge that Stefan had sacrificed himself for his brother without giving her the opportunity to find another way. He did it because Damon was dying, and because whatever had fractured between the brothers over a century and a half of damage had never fully destroyed the fact that they were brothers, that the bond ran beneath the wounds in a way that neither of them had adequate language for. Klaus gave the cure. Damon recovered. He woke from the fever on a Saturday morning with his eyes clearing and the colour returning to his face, and Elena beside him, still there, still present, in the way she was always present when he had reached the limit of what he could manage alone. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Stefan paid for this," she said before he could ask. "He made a deal with Klaus. He's gone with him. We don't know for how long." The grief that crossed Damon's face was unperformed and immediate. The grief of someone who has been saved at a cost they were not asked to authorize. He closed his eyes. "He shouldn't have done that," he said. "No," Elena agreed, "but he did, because he loves you." The silence between them was full of everything that had happened in that room over the preceding days. Every unguarded word and every honest moment, and the particular intimacy of having held someone through the worst of something and still been there when the worst of it passed. Elena did not pretend, after that Damon meant nothing to her. She could not have pretended convincingly, and she had never been a person who spent energy on performances she could not sustain. What she felt was real and complicated and entirely inconvenient, and she would need time to understand its shape. But the shape was there, undeniable, assembled from every conversation and every confrontation and every moment of sitting in the dark beside someone who had spent 145 years making sure no one stayed long enough to see him clearly. She had stayed, she had seen him, and what she had seen had not made her leave. That was not nothing. For Damon Salvatore, who had organized an entire immortal existence around the expectation of abandonment, it was very nearly everything. Stefan left with Klaus on a Tuesday, and the absence he created was not the clean, definable absence of someone who has died or moved away, or made a choice that closed the door neatly behind them. It was the complicated, ragged absence of someone who was still alive somewhere, still reachable in theory, still the person Elena had loved, but operating in a version of himself that she could not access and was not certain she would recognize if she could. Klaus had taken Stefan's sobriety as the price of Damon's life, and Stefan had paid it without negotiation, which meant that somewhere on the road between Mystic Falls and wherever Klaus was moving through the country, Stefan Salvatore was feeding on human blood for the first time in decades. The control he had built over years of discipline and sacrifice was being systematically dismantled, not by force, but by compliance. And the compliance was its own particular horror, because Stefan had chosen it, had chosen Damon, had made the trade with full understanding of what it would cost him, and had made it anyway. Elena did not know how to carry this. She carried it the way she carried most difficult things, by continuing to move, by organizing the grief into something functional, by directing the helplessness toward whatever action was available. She called Stefan's phone and left messages that she did not expect him to return. She researched Klaus and his history with the obsessive thoroughness that Bonnie recognized as Elena's particular response to situations that felt uncontrollable. She sat with Jeremy in the evenings and helped him with homework, and held the household together with the quiet steadiness that had always been her primary contribution to the people she loved. And she worked with Damon. It began as necessity. Damon was the one with the supernatural knowledge and the centuries of experience and the complete absence of compunction about using either. He was also the one who had the most immediate motivation to find Stefan, not because he had engineered Stefan's sacrifice, but precisely because he hadn't, because it had been done without his knowledge or consent, and the guilt of it was something he was managing in the loud and destructive way he managed most things he didn't know how to process quietly. "You didn't ask him to do it," Elena said. The first week, sitting across from him at the dining room table of the boarding house with a map of Klaus's known movements between them. "I know that," Damon said. "Then stop acting like you did," she said. "The self-flagellation isn't helping anyone, and it's making you reckless, which is the last thing any of us needs right now." He looked at her across the map. "You're remarkably unsentimental for someone who's supposed to be worried about her boyfriend." "I am worried about my boyfriend," she said evenly. "That's why I need you functional. So can you be functional? Or do you need more time to feel terrible first?" Something shifted in his expression, moving through what might have been irritation and arriving somewhere closer to a grudging recognition. "I can be functional," he said. "Good," Elena said, and turned back to the map. They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks that neither of them designed or discussed, but that both of them adapted to with a naturalness that would have been surprising if either of them had been paying attention to it as a phenomenon rather than simply living inside it. Damon drove. Elena navigated and researched and asked the right questions in the right order, cutting through the available information with a precision he found himself respecting in a way that had nothing to do with the fact that he found everything about her distracting. She trained. This had been Alaric's project initially, the teaching of a human girl to defend herself in a town that kept producing supernatural threats with reliable frequency. But Alaric was unreliable in his availability, and Damon was not. He taught her to move, to use her size as an advantage rather than a liability, to think about exits before she needed them. He was not gentle about it, which she appreciated, because gentleness in that context would have been condescension dressed up as care. Again, he said, on a Thursday evening in the Salvatore basement, after she had attempted and failed for the fourth time to get past his guard in a training exercise. "I just did it 4 times, she said, catching her breath. "You failed to do it 4 times, he corrected. "There's a distinction." She looked at him with an expression that contained both exasperation and the specific alertness of someone who is actually learning. "You're not going to let me be bad at this, are you?" "You don't have the option of being bad at this," he said. "The things that come after you don't grade on a curve." She came at him again, and this time she used the angle he had described 3 sessions ago. The one she had been executing incorrectly because she kept defaulting to the obvious approach, and she got past his guard and had the practice stake at his ribs before he could redirect her. She stepped back, breathing hard, and looked at him with an expression of genuine satisfaction. "Better," he said, and the word was simple and unembellished, and it landed with the weight of something real because Damon did not say better unless he meant it. The motel outside Knoxville, Tennessee came in October, on a night when the lead they had been following had turned into a dead end, and the drive back to Mystic Falls was too long for a single stretch, and the rain had made the roads dangerous enough that stopping was the practical choice rather than simply the convenient one. Elena took one room. Damon took the one adjacent to it, which in the budget motel's particular architecture meant that the wall between them was thin enough to hear the television through. She knocked on the connecting door an hour after they had checked in, because she had been lying on the bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about Stefan feeding on someone in whatever city Klaus had moved through, and the thinking had become a weight she needed to put down somewhere. Damon opened the door with the expression of someone who had also been lying on the bed staring at the ceiling, though he would not have described it that way. "I can't stop thinking about where he is right now," she said. Not a question, not a request, just a statement, offered to the one person who understood its specific content. Damon was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Is he in there?" she asked. "The Stefan we know. Is he still in there somewhere underneath what Klaus has done to him?" "Yes," Damon said, and the certainty in it was not performed. "Stefan's never fully gone. He comes back. He always has." She leaned against the doorframe, looking at him. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because I know my brother," he said. "Better than anyone. Better than he knows himself some days. He's harder to destroy than either of you think." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Stay," she said. "Just come sit in here. I don't want to be alone with my thoughts for the rest of the night." He looked at her steadily. "That's not a good idea, Elena." "I know it's not," she said. "Stay anyway." He stayed. They sat on opposite sides of the room and talked until past midnight, not about Stefan and Klaus, but about other things, older things, the way that Mystic Falls had looked in 1864 and whether it was recognizable to him now, what it had been like to exist through the years of the 20th century as someone who could not age and could not stop watching the world change around him. "Did you ever want to stop?" she asked. "Just at some point in all those years, did you ever want to be done?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, rather than deflecting it. "There were periods," he said, "decades, where the whole thing felt like an obligation nobody had asked me to sign on for." He paused, less so lately. She looked at him. He did not look back, which told her everything the non-answer was designed to obscure. The kiss happened in November, on a night when they had returned from finding Stefan in a Chicago bar and watching him be someone Elena did not recognize. Someone fast and cold and performing a freedom from consequence that looked nothing like the Stefan she had built her recovery around. She had been shaking with it in the car on the way home, not crying, just vibrating with the specific distress of someone who has seen something they cannot unsee. Damon pulled over. He turned in the driver's seat and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something that was entirely concentrated, entirely present, all of the usual deflection set aside. "He'll come back," he said. "You don't know that," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "I do know that," he said. "I told you, he always comes back." She looked at him in the dark of the pulled-over car, on a Virginia back road with the headlights cutting into the trees. And whatever had been building between them for a year and a half rose to the surface of the moment and simply stayed there, too large to be managed back down. She kissed him. It was not ambiguous, and it was not accidental, and it was not the product of grief or confusion, or the specific vulnerability of a difficult night, or not only those things. It was a choice, made with the clarity that comes when a person is too tired to continue pretending that the choice is not available to them. He kissed her back, and for a moment, everything that was complicated became irrelevant. Then she pulled away and pressed her fingers briefly against her own mouth and looked at him with an expression that held the kiss and the guilt and the confusion all at once. "I can't," she said. "Stefan, I can't do this while Stefan is out there." "I know," Damon said, and his voice was steady in a way that cost him something. "That doesn't mean it wasn't real," she said. "I need you to know that. What just happened, it was real." "I know that too," he said. He pulled back onto the road and drove her home, and neither of them spoke for the rest of the drive, and the silence was full of the kiss and the pulling away and the admission that the kiss had been real, which was its own kind of terrible tenderness. She told Stefan she loved Damon. Not that night, not for months after that night, but eventually, in the spring of that year, when Stefan had returned to himself through the slow and painful process of reclamation that was always his path back, when he was standing in front of her with his own face again and his own eyes, and asking her quietly and directly where they stood. She was honest with him because she had never been able to be otherwise, not with Stefan, who deserved her honesty more than almost anyone. "I love you," she said. "I do. That's real and it's not going away." Stefan waited because he could hear the shape of what was coming. "I love Damon too," she said. The words were careful and clear and entirely unhedged. Not "I have feelings for Damon," not "I'm confused about Damon." "I love Damon too." The two doing the most significant work in the sentence, insisting on the reality of both without using one to diminish the other. Stefan received this with the stillness of someone who has been bracing for an impact and finds that the impact, when it arrives, is both exactly as bad as anticipated and somehow more survivable than feared. "I know," he said finally. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "Not for being honest." He looked at her with the clear-eyed sadness of someone who is experiencing something real and has decided to experience it honestly rather than managing it into something more bearable. "I knew. I think I've known for a while. I just needed you to know too." She reached out and took his hand, and he let her, and they sat with the truth of it without trying to make it into something other than what it was. The end of one thing and the unresolved beginning of another, balanced on the word "to" in the middle of a sentence that had taken her a year and a half to be ready to say. Damon heard about it later, secondhand, through the particular grapevine of a household that was too small and too perceptive for anyone's secrets to remain entirely private. He did not seek her out that night. He did not make the moment into anything it wasn't ready to be. He sat in the parlor with a drink he actually consumed this time and turned the information over in his mind with the careful attention of someone who has received something fragile and is trying to determine whether he can be trusted to hold it without breaking it. She had said it out loud. To Stefan, she loved Damon too. He had spent 145 years being the wrong choice, the dangerous option, the brother you didn't bring home, the feeling you didn't act on because acting on it would cost too much. He did not know yet what to do with the information that someone had looked at all of that and said to anyway. But he was, for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, willing to find out. The bridge came back for her in the spring of her second year, knowing the truth about mystic fools, and it came back the way the worst things tend to return, not as something new, but as a repetition, the universe insisting on a particular lesson until the lesson had been fully received. Elena was in the car with Matt Donovan when it happened, on the same road, over the same water, the geography of her worst night reconstituting itself with a precision that felt deliberate. Rebecca forced them off Wickery Bridge, and the car went into the river, and the cold and the dark arrived with a specific quality of a memory that has become real again. And somewhere in the water, Elena, Gilbert died for the first time. She had Damon's blood in her system. This was the fact that changed everything, the small and seemingly incidental detail that rewrote the story entirely. Damon had given her his blood days earlier as a precaution, as the kind of measure that felt responsible given everything Mystic Falls kept producing, and neither of them had imagined it would matter in the way it ended up mattering. Stefan pulled her from the water, choosing to save Matt first because Elena had communicated in the last coherent moment available to her that this was what she wanted. By the time Stefan reached her, she was gone. And then she was not gone. She was something else. The transition back in the Gilbert house was not dramatic in the way that death is dramatic. It was quiet and disorienting and deeply strange. Elena lying in her own bed, in her own room, surrounded by the familiar objects of her human life. Understanding in increments that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of her existence. The sounds came first, the particular sharpness of everything, the way the world seemed to have been turned up to a volume she had not known was available, every heartbeat in the house audible, every breath, every small friction of fabric against skin registering with a clarity that was simultaneously extraordinary and overwhelming. Then the hunger arrived, and it was unlike anything her human experience had given her language for. Stefan was there, and Damon was there, and Caroline was there with the particular competence of someone who had already navigated this transition and had come out the other side, and was determined to make Eleanor's crossing less brutal than her own had been. "It's going to feel like too much," Caroline told her, sitting beside her on the bed with a steadiness that Eleanor was deeply grateful for. "Everything is too much at first. The sounds, the smells, the feelings. It doesn't stay this intense. You learn to filter it." "When?" Elena asked, and her own voice sounded different to her, cleaner and more resonant than she remembered it. "Faster than you think," Caroline said. "But you have to feed first. You have to complete the transition, or none of the rest of it matters." Elena looked at her. "I know what completing the transition means. I know you know," Caroline said gently. "I'm telling you it's okay, that it doesn't make you something terrible. It makes you what we are, and what we are is manageable. I promise you it's manageable." Damon was in the doorway during this exchange, and Eleanor felt his presence before she saw him, which was itself a new and disorienting quality of her altered perception. This awareness of the specific gravitational field of specific people. He was watching her with an expression she could read more clearly now than she had been able to as a human. The increased acuity of her new senses extending to the reading of faces, and what she read on his was a complexity she did not have time yet to fully pass. Relief that she was alive, grief at the cost of it, guilt at the role his blood had played, the unintended consequence of a precaution neither of them had imagined would be triggered, And underneath all of it, something quieter and more persistent. The thing that had been there for 2 years now, that had survived every complication and every act of self-sabotage, and every choice he had made to erase or minimize or deflect it. She completed the transition. The details of how were less important than the fact of it, the crossing of the threshold from which there was no return. And when it was done, Eleanor Gilbert sat in her childhood bedroom and understood that she was 17 years old and will be 17 years old forever, which was both the strangest and the most familiar, impossible thing she had yet encountered. In a life that had been accumulating impossible things at a considerable rate, the sire bond emerged within days, identified by Damon first, and then confirmed by the others with the particular discomfort of people delivering news they know will complicate everything. The mechanics of it were simple and brutal. Elena had transitioned on Damon's blood, which made him her sire, which meant that her impulses oriented toward him in ways that were difficult to distinguish from genuine feeling, because they operated through genuine feeling rather than alongside it. She did not do things because she had been commanded. She did things because she wanted to, and the wanting was real, but the wanting had been shaped by the bond in ways that made the question of its origin unanswerable from the inside. Damon understood what it meant before Elena fully did, and his response was characteristic in the worst and best ways simultaneously. He was furious, not at Elena, but at the situation, at the universe's apparent commitment to ensuring that nothing between them could exist without a complicating factor large enough to call the entire enterprise into question. And he was, beneath the fury, genuinely tormented by it. "What if none of it is real?" he said to Stefan, in a conversation Elena was not meant to hear, but did hear, because she could hear everything now. What if everything she feels is just a bond? What if I've spent 2 years watching something develop that was never actually there? Stefan was quiet for a moment. "Does it feel like compulsion to you?" he asked. "When you're with her, does it feel like she's responding to a command rather than to you?" "I don't know," Damon said. "I don't know how to tell the difference from the outside." "Then you need to find out," Stefan said, "because if you don't resolve this, it will sit underneath everything, forever." Damon's response to the sire bond was to do the thing that cost him the most, which was consistent with who he had been slowly, reluctantly, imperfectly becoming over the preceding 2 years. He tried to create distance. He tried to send Elena back toward Stefan, toward the uncomplicated love that had existed before any of this had complicated it, toward the version of her life that did not require her to sort through a supernatural bond to locate her own genuine feelings. It did not work cleanly, because nothing between them had ever worked cleanly. Elena was not a person who responded well to being managed, even by someone whose management came from a place of genuine care rather than self-interest, and she understood what Damon was doing, and she resisted it with the particular stubbornness that was one of her most deeply rooted qualities. "You're doing it again," she said, finding him in the parlor on a November evening, his back to the door in the particular posture she had learned to recognize as preemptive withdrawal. "You're pushing me away because you think it's the right thing to do." "The sire bond is real, Elena," he said, without turning around. "You can't know what you feel is yours and not the bonds. "Then let me find out," she said. "That's not how it works," he said. "You can't investigate your own feelings from inside them. The bond distorts your perception. You can't trust what you..." "I can't trust what I feel," she interrupted, her voice carrying the specific edge she got when she was about to say something that was going to be difficult to take back. "Is that what you're telling me? That I should not trust my own experience because you've decided it's contaminated?" He turned then, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was in genuine pain and had not yet decided whether to acknowledge it. "I'm telling you that I won't take something from you that you haven't been able to freely give. And you can't freely give anything until the bond is broken." She looked at him across the room with the new clarity of her vampire senses, and what she saw was a man who was doing the most selfless thing he knew how to do and finding it almost unbearable. "Break it then," she said. "Tell me how to break it and I'll break it, and then we'll know." The breaking of the sire bond required Elena to confront her feelings rather than act on them, to examine what she felt with a distance of deliberate separation and determine whether the feelings survived the examination. She went through the weeks of that process with the same methodical honesty she brought to everything that mattered to her, asking herself in the quiet of her own mind whether what she felt for Damon was something she was oriented toward by a supernatural mechanism or something that had been assembling itself from real material over real time. The answer she arrived at was not a surprise to her, though it surprised other people. She found Damon in the Salvatore house on the December evening, and she stood in the parlor doorway and looked at him with an expression that had none of the uncertainty of the preceding months. "The bond is broken," she said. He looked at her with careful stillness, not allowing himself to respond to this information before he understood what she was going to do with it. "I know," she said. "I know what you're going to say, that I should take time, that I should make sure, that the responsible thing is to wait and be certain." "Elena," he began. "I'm not sorry I'm in love with you," she said, simply and without qualification. "I was in love with you before the transition, and I was in love with you through the sire bond, and I am in love with you now that the bond is gone, and none of those three things are different from each other. It's the same feeling. It has always been the same feeling. I just kept finding reasons not to say it plainly." The silence that followed was the most honest silence the room had ever held. "You're sure?" he said, and it was not a challenge to her certainty, but a genuine question from someone who had spent a very long time not being sure about anything that mattered. "I'm sure," she said. He crossed the room, and she did not move away. And what happened next was not tentative or cautious or qualified by anything. It was simply two people who'd been moving toward each other for 2 years finally arriving, without apology, at the place the movement had always been heading. Stefan received the news with the quiet dignity that was his nature, the dignity of someone who has already known a thing and has done the private work of accepting it before being asked to do the public work. He told Elena that he wanted her to be happy. He told Damon, in a separate and shorter conversation, that if he hurt her, he would make him regret it, which Damon accepted as both a reasonable position and an expression of love from the only person who had ever consistently refused to give up on him. The early weeks of Damon and Elena as an actual couple had the particular quality of something that has been deferred for so long that its arrival feels both inevitable and slightly unreal. They argued the way they had always argued, directly and without the management of feelings that had characterized their earlier interactions, because now the argument could end with something other than the careful restoration of necessary distance. He was protective of her in ways that occasionally required her to push back, because Eleanor Gilbert had never been someone who accepted protection that came at the cost of agency. And Damon was learning, imperfectly and with some resistance, the distinction between keeping someone safe and making their decisions for them. She was, for the first time in the 2 years since her parents had died on Wickery Bridge, entirely present in her own life. Not managing it, not performing recovery, not being the steady one for everyone else's benefit. Present, in love, chosen and choosing in return. It was not simple, and it was not without complication, and it was not the kind of relationship that could ever be entirely free of the weight of everything that had preceded it. But it was real, which was the only thing either of them had ever needed it to be. And real, for two people who had spent considerable time and energy in the vicinity of things that were not, was more than enough. The thing about loving Damon Salvatore, Elena discovered in the months after they stopped pretending they were not doing exactly that, was that it did not simplify anything. She had not expected it to simplify anything. She was not a person who confused the resolution of uncertainty with the removal of difficulty, and she had known Damon long enough to understand that choosing him was not the end of a complicated story, but the beginning of a different kind of one. What she had not fully anticipated was how much she would learn about him that she had not known before. Not the surface things, not the charm and the cruelty, and the century and a half of accumulated damage that she had been observing and cataloguing since the night she had met him in the Salvatore parlor. The deeper things, the things that only become visible when someone stops performing for you, because the performance is no longer necessary. The Augustine Society came to her attention in the autumn of their first year together, surfacing through the particular kind of accidental discovery that mystic fools specialized in. The wrong door opened at the wrong moment, the document found in the wrong drawer, the piece of information that arrived before anyone had decided whether to share it. Elena pulled at the thread with the methodical persistence that was her nature, and what unraveled was a history she had not been prepared for. Damon had been a prisoner of the Augustine Society for 5 years in the 1950s. He had been captured by Dr. Whitmore, a man whose relationship to medical research had no ethical boundary that Eleanor could identify, and he had been kept in a cell in the basement of Whitmore House and subjected to systematic experimentation for the entirety of those 5 years. The experiments were not metaphorical. They were specific and sustained and designed to test the limits of vampire healing and vampire endurance, which meant they were designed to find those limits by exceeding them repeatedly. Eleanor found this out on a Wednesday, sitting at the desk in the Salvatore library with a file that should not have been where she found it, and she sat with the information for a long time before she went to find Damon. He was in the kitchen, which was where he sometimes was in the evenings, performing the domestic normalcy that still occasionally surprised her in him. The capacity for ordinary moments that coexisted with everything else he was. "Tell me about Augustine," she said. He turned from the counter with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he had been caught in the vicinity of something true and was calculating how much of it was navigable. "Where did you find that?" he said. "The library," she said. "The file was misfiled, or maybe it wasn't." She paused. "Tell me." He put down what he was holding and leaned against the counter and looked at her with the expression he wore when he had decided that deflection was not going to be available to him. "1950s, he said. "Whitmore had me for 5 years, experimented on me, cut me open and put me back together and cut me open again because I kept healing, which was the whole point." His voice was level in the way voices become level when the material they're covering has been compressed under pressure for a very long time. "I compelled myself to forget most of it eventually. It was that, or spend the next several decades non-functional." Elena was quiet for a moment, absorbing this with the steadiness she brought to difficult things, while her interior registered something considerably less steady. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because it's not a story that improves anything," he said. "Knowing it doesn't change it. It just adds it to the list of things you carry." "That's not your decision to make," she said, and her voice was gentle but entirely clear. "What I carry, that's mine." He looked at her across the kitchen, and something in his face shifted, the slight and involuntary softening that he still did not always manage to suppress in her presence. "I know," he said. "I'm angry on your behalf," she said. "I want you to know that. Not at you. For you. Whatever was done to you in that place was done to you without your consent, and it was monstrous, and you are allowed to have been damaged by it." He said nothing for a moment, and she understood that the nothing was because he did not have immediate access to a response for being offered uncomplicated fury on his behalf from someone with no personal stake in the outcome. "You're very strange," he said finally, which was what he said when something she did reached a part of him he had not prepared an answer for. "I know," she said, which was what she said when she understood that he meant it as the opposite of an insult. The darkness that the Augustine history had planted in him was not new, but Elena understood it differently after the file. The self-destructive cycles that characterized his worst periods, the way he reached for cruelty or violence, when something good came close enough to threaten the careful, low expectations he maintained for himself, the reflexive anticipation of loss that made him sometimes behave in ways designed to ensure the loss would come on his terms rather than someone else's. These were not simply character flaws or the inheritance of 160 years of vampirism. They were the behaviors of someone who had been taught repeatedly and thoroughly that being at someone else's mercy was the most dangerous condition available. Elena did not excuse the behaviors. She was incapable of excusing them, which he respected, and she told him so with the directness that was one of the things he had loved about her since before he had admitted to himself that he loved anything about her. "Understanding why you do something," she told him one evening, after an incident she was not yet ready to stop being angry about, "is not the same as it being acceptable. You know that, right?" "I know that," he said. "Then act like you know it," she said. Because I can see you. I can see all of it, the history and the damage and the reasons, and I'm still here. And that means you don't have to blow things up to test whether I'll leave. I'm telling you directly, I'm not leaving. You can stop testing it. He looked at her for a long time. What if I can't stop? He said, and the honesty of it was more unsettling than any of his deflections had ever been. The genuine uncertainty of someone who has operated on a particular set of assumptions for so long that abandoning them feels structurally dangerous. Then we figure it out, she said. Together. But you have to want to figure it out. You have to decide that what we have is worth the work of not destroying it. It's worth it, he said, without hesitation, which was itself a kind of progress, the absence of the usual ironic distance between the feeling and its expression. Jeremy died in the spring, not the compelled near death of earlier years, not a reversible tragedy with a supernatural solution waiting in the wings. Jeremy Gilbert died genuinely and permanently, and the loss of him reorganized Elena's interior world with the totality of a catastrophic event, because Jeremy had been her last immediate family, the last person who shared the particular texture of her childhood and her parents, and the life she had lived before Mystic Falls had revealed its true nature to her. She turned off her humanity. The decision, if it could be called a decision, happened in the way that the most consequential choices sometimes happen, not through deliberation, but through the sudden and overwhelming sense that the alternative, which was feeling all of it, was simply not survivable. The switch, which Caroline had described to her during her transition, and which Elena had filed away as information she hoped she would never need to use, was not a metaphor. It was a real and available mechanism, and Elena reached for it in the hours after Jeremy's death with the desperate pragmatism of someone choosing numbness over annihilation. What followed was deeply alarming to everyone who loved her, and entirely logical from the inside of the state she had entered. Without her emotions, Elena was efficient and clear-eyed, and completely without the moral framework that had always been her most defining characteristic. She said precise and devastating things to the people closest to her, identifying their vulnerabilities with the accuracy of someone who had spent years learning them through love and was now applying that knowledge without love's restraint. She said things to Damon designed to reach the places she knew were least defended. She knew exactly where to aim, and she aimed there without hesitation, because that was what the absence of feeling permitted, the removal of the inhibition that caring creates. Damon did not retaliate. This was not because the things she said did not land. They did, with the precision she had intended, but because he understood what was happening with a clarity that came from knowing her better than almost anyone. This was not Elena. This was Elena in the absence of Elena, and the distinction mattered more than his own pain. He sat across from her in the Salvatore parlor on an afternoon when she had been particularly surgical in her cruelty, and he looked at her with an expression that was steady in the way things are steady when they have been asked to hold a great deal of weight. "I know you think I'll give up," he said, "that I'll decide the easier thing is to let you stay like this. I need you to understand that I'm not going to do that." "You can't make me turn it back on," she said, pleasantly, in the tone of someone stating a fact. "No," he said, "I can't make you do anything, but I can make you want to." She raised an eyebrow. And how do you intend to do that? Because you love me, he said. Even without the switch, even in there somewhere underneath all of this, you love me. And I'm going to remind you of that until you can't ignore it anymore. She looked at him with a detached assessment of her switched off state. That's a considerable gamble. I know, he said. I'm good at those. The leverage, when it came, arrived through his own particular willingness to mirror her vulnerability back at her. He told her, with the witnesses necessary to make it credible, that if she did not turn her humanity back on, he would turn his off. That he would become, without the feeling that had been slowly and painfully reorganizing him for 3 years, something she did not want to be responsible for releasing into the world. It reached her, not because she was afraid of what he would become, though that was part of it, but because somewhere underneath the switched off state, the love he had named was still present, still functional, still oriented toward him with the consistency she had described to him in December, when she had told him she was not sorry. She turned it back on, and the grief arrived in a wave that was exactly as unsurvivable feeling as she had anticipated. Jeremy's death and everything that surrounded it crashing through her with the accumulated force of all the weeks it had been held back. Damon was there. He had been there for all of it, through the cruelty and the distance and the surgical precision of her switched off state. And he was there when the feeling came back, sitting beside her on the floor of the Salvatore parlor with his arms around her, while she processed the enormity of what she had been holding at bay. She cried for a very long time. He did not tell her it would be all right, because he did not know that it would be all right, and she would not have believed him if he had said it. He simply stayed, which was what she had done for him in the dark parlor after the tomb, and the staying was its own complete language. Silas arrived in the same period and brought with him the complications of a supernatural timeline that predated everything any of them had encountered. A 500-year-old story of doppelgangers and true immortality, and a prison world that required anchors and sacrifices, and the particular cruelty of hope repeatedly extended and withdrawn. Damon died in the collapse of the other side, which was what the place where dead supernatural creatures went was called, and he died in the company of Bonnie Bennett, both of them standing on the edge of a collapsing dimension and understanding in the final moments that the edge was the last solid ground available. Elena received this information from people who had been present, and what she felt was not clean or manageable or the kind of grief she could organize into something functional. It was the specific devastation of a person who has finally, after years of working toward it, allowed themselves to fully arrive in something good, and has then had that thing taken before the arrival was complete. She made a decision in the weeks after Damon's death that she would later understand as the most expensive decision she had ever made. She went to Alaric, who was a vampire again, through the complicated mechanisms that Mystic Falls kept generating, and she asked him to compel her to forget that she had ever loved Damon. Not to forget Damon, not to forget their history, but to forget the love specifically, to have the feeling removed while leaving the facts intact. Alaric did it because she asked him to, and because he understood that she was not able to survive what she was carrying, and because he loved her enough to give her what she was asking for, even knowing it was the wrong thing. the compulsion worked. Elena moved through the subsequent weeks without the weight of the specific grief, functioning again, present in her life again, and the people around her watched this with the discomfort of people witnessing a solution that has solved the wrong problem. What none of them had anticipated, and what Elena could not have predicted from inside a state she had engineered herself not to feel, was that the love, once removed from her conscious access, did not disappear from her behavior. She was drawn to Damon in the same way she had always been drawn to him. The same instincts, the same attentiveness, the same quality of being more fully present in his vicinity than anywhere else, operating without the feeling that had generated them, like a compass that has had its needle removed, but whose casing still turns toward north. Damon came back through the mechanism that Bonnie eventually found, and when he returned and stood in the Salvatore house and looked at Elena, he understood within moments that something was wrong. Not wrong with her, not wrong with the situation in any way he could immediately identify, but wrong in the specific way of absence, the way a room feels different when something that should be in it is not. She remembered their history. She was kind to him. She was warm in the general way she was warm with everyone she cared about. She did not look at him the way she had looked at him before. He found out what she had done from Stefan, who delivered the information with the quiet care of someone who understood. It would hurt and could not make it hurt less by managing its delivery. Damon sat with the knowledge that the woman he loved had chosen to stop loving him, not because her feelings had changed, but because the feelings had become too much to carry, and he found, sitting with it, that he could not be angry at her for it. He could only be the thing he had always been most reluctant to be: patient, present, willing to wait for her to come back to herself, or to a version of herself that included what had been removed, on her own terms and in her own time. He did not perform this patience, he simply had it, which was perhaps the clearest evidence available that he had become, in the years since a dark road and a bridge, and the girl with wet hair looking up at him without calculation. Someone meaningfully different from who he had been when he arrived. Kai Parker arrived in their lives the way certain kinds of destruction arrive, not with obvious menace, but with a smile and a particular quality of attention that took a moment too long to recognize as wrong. He was a siphoner, a witch who could not generate his own magic, but could absorb it from external sources. And he was, beneath the charm and the self-aware humor he deployed with practiced ease, one of the most genuinely dangerous people any of them had encountered in a town that had produced considerable competition for that distinction. He had been imprisoned in a prison world for 18 years, a dimension constructed specifically to contain him, after he had massacred most of his own coven on the day that was supposed to mark his merge with his twin sister Jo. The Gemini coven had decided, with the unanimity of people who had witnessed what he was capable of, that death was insufficient and that a private eternity was more appropriate. He had spent 18 years alone in a looping replica of 1994. And when he got out, he was exactly as dangerous as the people who had imprisoned him had feared, and considerably more motivated. Kai merged with his twin brother Luke, which gave him the completion of power he had always lacked. And then he went to Jo and Alaric's wedding, and he did what Kai Parker did in moments of maximum vulnerability in other people's lives. He detonated it. He stabbed Jo in the abdomen at the altar, killing her and the twin she was carrying. And then he turned to the rest of the gathered guests with the specific expression of someone who is enjoying themselves enormously, and he cast the spell he had been building toward. He linked Elena to Bonnie. The mechanics of it were elegant in the way that only genuinely cruel things manage to be elegant, simple and targeted, and almost impossible to reverse. Elena would sleep. She would remain alive, preserved and unchanging, but unconscious until the link was broken. The link would break when Bonnie died. Since Bonnie was a living person with a normal human lifespan ahead of her, this meant Elena would sleep for decades. Since Bonnie was also someone Damon loved, and someone Elena loved, and someone who had sacrificed more for the people around her than anyone had any right to ask, this meant that breaking the link early was not a solution that anyone who knew Elena would be able to implement. Kai had understood this perfectly when he constructed it. That was the specific quality of his cruelty. It was not blunt. It was architectural. Damon held Elena while the spell took her, and what happened was not dramatic in the way that supernatural events sometimes were, not accompanied by visible magic or physical violence. She simply grew heavy in his arms, and her eyes closed, and her breathing slowed to the deep and even rhythm of someone in a sleep too complete for dreaming. And then she was still, and the stillness was absolute. He did not put her down for a long time. The decision about what to do with the sleeping curse was, in practical terms, made by Eleanor's absence rather than by any active choice. Bonnie was alive. Eleanor was linked to Bonnie. The only mechanism for waking Eleanor required Bonnie's death, and this was not a mechanism that Damon was going to use, not because he was incapable of it. He had spent 160 years being capable of most things, but because Elena would not want it. He knew this with the certainty of someone who had paid close attention to a person for long enough to understand not just what they wanted, but what they would want in circumstances they had not anticipated. Elena would want Bonnie to live. She would want the decades Bonnie had ahead of her to be lived fully, and without the shadow of being the reason Elena remained asleep. She would want, when she woke, to find Bonnie alive and present and grey-haired if the years cooperated, and she would be furious, in the specific and focused way she got furious, if she discovered that anyone had shortened Bonnie's life to shorten her sleep. Damon knew this, and so he put Elena in a coffin in the Salvatore crypt, in the soft light that filtered through the crypt's high windows, and he said things to her that he would not have been comfortable saying to her awake, because the honesty available to a person speaking to someone who cannot hear them is a different and more complete honesty than the kind available in ordinary conversation. "I'm going to be here when you wake up," he told her, on the first of what became many visits. "I don't know what I'm going to look like by then. I'm going to try to make sure it's something you'd recognize." He was not entirely successful in the years that followed. The trying was genuine and the failure was periodic, and the combination of the two was approximately what anyone familiar with Damon Salvatore would have predicted. The first year was the worst, in the way that first years of grief are always the worst, when the absence is still new enough to catch you off guard in ordinary moments. He found himself turning to say things to her that she could not hear. He found himself in the middle of conversations with other people and losing the thread because some secondary channel in his mind was still addressed to her, still running commentary that had nowhere to go. He drank more than was useful and less than was catastrophic, which represented, for this period, a kind of moderation. He got into conflicts he could have avoided and resolved some of them badly, and some of them with a restraint that surprised the people who witnessed it. He was not consistently good. He was not consistently anything. He was a person operating without the organizing principle that had structured the better part of 3 years. And the operating was uneven, in the way that things are uneven when the foundation has been temporarily removed. Stefan was present in ways that mattered. The brothers had arrived through the accumulation of everything that had happened between them and around them and despite them, at something that functioned as genuine companionship rather than merely shared history. They were not easy with each other in the way of people who have never damaged each other, but they were honest with each other in the way of people who have run out of reasons to maintain comfortable fictions, and in the absence of Elena as the organizing tension between them, they found room for something quieter. "You need to decide something," Stefan told him. In the second year, sitting in the parlor, that had been the site of more significant conversations than either of them could accurately count. "I'm listening," Damon said. "You need to decide whether you're going to wait for her by becoming someone she'd want to come back to," Stefan said, "or whether you're going to wait for her by falling apart, because you're currently doing both at the same time and it's exhausting to witness." Damon looked at him. "That's remarkably direct." "I learned it from someone," Stefan said. The decision, when Damon actually made it, was not a single moment, but a gradual accumulation of smaller ones, a series of choices that individually seemed unremarkable, but that together constituted a direction. He stopped reaching for destruction as a default response to difficulty. Not completely, not with the consistency of someone for whom the change had become effortless, but with the frequency of someone who had decided that the effort was worth making. He thought about what Elena had said to him in various conversations over various years, about the difference between understanding why you did something and it being acceptable. He thought about her voice when she had told him she was not leaving and he could stop testing it. He thought about the particular quality of her attention, the way she had always looked at him as if she were solving a problem she found genuinely interesting, and he held onto both the memory and the obligation it carried. He visited her in the crypt regularly, in the way that people who love someone they cannot reach develop rituals of proximity. He sat beside the coffin and talked about what had been happening in Mystic Falls, about things he was thinking about memories he had not previously examined in the particular light that absence creates. He told her things he should have told her when she was awake, not because it resolved anything, but because it was honest, and he had come to understand, through the years of her influence, that honesty had a value independent of its immediate utility. "I've been thinking about the bridge," he told her, on a winter evening in the third year, the crypt cold and blue-lit and entirely still. The first one, before everything. "I've been thinking about what I said to you that night, the things you weren't supposed to remember." He was quiet for a moment. You deserved a love that was epic, he said. That's what I told you. And I've been sitting with that word for 3 years now, wondering if I've been it. If I've been what I told you that you deserved. He paused. I don't think I was at first. I think I was passionate and I was real and I was completely committed. But epic implies something larger than that. It implies being the kind of person who grows, who becomes. Another pause. I'm working on it. Bonnie, in the years of Elena's sleep, became something she had always been moving toward, but had not quite fully arrived at before the curse. She was extraordinary in the specific way of people who have been tested past reasonable limits and have discovered, in the testing, that they contain more than they knew. She pursued her own life with the intentionality of someone who understood that she was carrying someone else's future in her continued survival, and she did not find this a burden, but a purpose. She and Damon developed, across the years, a friendship that neither of them would have predicted, and both of them came to depend on. It was built from shared grief and shared investment in the same person's eventual return, but it became its own thing, independent of Elena, valuable in itself, the particular intimacy of two people who have witnessed each other's worst and have chosen, inexplicably and without obligation, to keep showing up. You're different, Bonnie told him in the 4th year, with the directness she had always had, but that the years had refined into something more precise. Am I? He said, and it was not quite a question. You're still difficult, she said. You're still occasionally terrible, but you're different. You make different choices than you used to. Elena would say it's not enough, he said. Elena would say keep going, Bonnie corrected. There's a difference. Stefan's death came in the final year before Bonnie found the mechanism to break the curse, and it arrived with the particular cruelty of a loss that is simultaneously inevitable and impossible to prepare for. Stefan sacrificed himself to stop Hellfire from destroying Mystic Falls, choosing, in the final calculation of his long and complicated existence, to give his life for the town that had shaped him and the people he loved. He died in the company of his brother, which was how he had always wanted to go, and the last thing he told Damon was that he was proud of him, which undid something in Damon that had been knotted for a very long time. He sat with Stefan's absence in the way he had learned, over years and through considerable difficulty, to sit with loss, which was directly and without the management of it into something more survivable. He let it be what it was, which was enormous and real, and the specific grief of losing the person who had known him longest, who had seen the worst of him and the best of him, and had decided, across a century and a half of damage and repair, that the brother underneath all of it was worth the trouble. He went to the crypt after Stefan's funeral, and he sat beside Elena's coffin in the silence, and he did not try to find words for what he was feeling, because some things resist language, and the resistance is not a failure. Bonnie found a way to break the curse in the late spring of the year after Stefan's death, working through a combination of her own considerable power and the knowledge accumulated across years of dedicated research. The mechanism required a sacrifice of a different kind than Elena's death, something Bonnie had that could be offered and reclaimed, and the specifics of it were less important than the outcome, which was real and imminent and about to change everything again. Damon learned that Elena would wake in a matter of days, and what he felt was not simply relief, though relief was present and enormous. What he felt was the specific anxiety of someone who has spent years preparing for a moment and is now confronting the possibility that the preparation was insufficient. He had tried to become someone she would want to wake up to. He had made choices with that intention. He had grown in the directions he could identify and failed in the directions he could not always see. But he did not know and could not know until she opened her eyes whether what he had become in the years she had been sleeping was recognizable to her as the person she had chosen. Whether the Damon she had loved and the Damon who had spent years in the quiet work of trying to deserve that love were continuous enough to still be the same person. He went to the crypt the night before Bonnie was going to perform the spell, and he sat beside her in the blue winter light, and he said the last thing he needed to say before the waiting ended. "I don't know if I did it right," he said quietly. "The waiting, the trying. I don't know if what I am now is what you would have wanted me to become. I made some of it better, and some of it I'm still working on, and some of it I'm not sure is fixable." He was quiet for a moment. "But I'm here. I stayed. I want you to know that I stayed, not because I didn't have other options, but because there were no other options that made sense. There was only ever this." He rested his hand over hers, his fingers closing gently around her still ones. "Come back," he said. "I'll be right here." The morning came slowly, the way mornings come in late winter, the light arriving in gradations rather than all at once, and Damon Salvatore sat in the Salvatore crypt and waited for the woman he loved to open her eyes. And for the first time in years, the waiting had an end in sight, and the end was close enough to reach. Elena Gilbert opened her eyes on a morning in late winter, and the first thing she saw was the face of a man who had been waiting for her. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical intensity that had characterized so many of the moments in their history together, the confrontations and the confessions and the carefully constructed occasions of almost. Simply waiting, in the particular way of someone who has done the work of being patient and has arrived at genuine peace with the waiting, seated beside her in the still blue light of the crypt with his hand over hers and his eyes open and present in the way eyes are when a person has not been sleeping. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The waking was gradual, the world assembling itself back into coherent form around her, sounds and light and the specific gravity of the particular room. Then her eyes found his and stayed there, and something in her expression moved through confusion and into recognition, and then into something quieter and more complete than either. "Hi," she said. Her voice was rough from years of disuse, and it was the most ordinary word available, and it was exactly right. "Hi," Damon said, and his voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been asked to hold a great deal of weight and have held it. She sat up slowly, and he helped her without making the helping into anything more than practical, and she looked around the crypt and then back at him with a clear-eyed assessment that had always been one of her most defining qualities. "How long?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. "Bonnie is alive. Everyone who could be is still here." She absorbed this, reading between the words with the fluency of someone who had always understood what he was not saying as readily as what he was. "Stefan," she said. Stefan, he confirmed. And the two syllables carried everything that could not be compressed into a longer sentence without losing something essential. She reached out and took his hand, not in consolation exactly, but in the way of someone who understands that grief shared between two people who both carry it is a different weight than grief carried alone. He let her, and they sat in the blue crypt light with Stefan's absence between them and around them, and both of them bearing it in the way that people bear the loss of someone who was irreplaceable, which is to say imperfectly, and with the full acknowledgement that imperfect is the only option available. After a while she looked at him again, with an expression he recognized from years of learning to read her face, the particular quality of attention she brought to things she was about to say plainly. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed," he said. "You didn't have to," she said. Not as a challenge, as an acknowledgement of the choice, the specific weight of something that had been freely given rather than extracted. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him for a long moment, and what was in her expression was not the complicated mixture of feeling and resistance and guilt and longing that had characterized so much of their earlier history. It was simpler than that, clarified by years of sleep and whatever the sleep had done to the noise surrounding what she actually felt. It was simply recognition. The recognition of a person who has come back to a place they always intended to return to and found it still there, still itself, still where it was supposed to be. The life they built afterward was not a story anyone would have written for them at the beginning. It was not without difficulty, and it was not without the weight of everything that had preceded it. The deaths and the betrayals and the accumulated cost of years lived in a town that had never been entirely safe for anyone who loved someone else. Damon was not transformed into something uncomplicated by the years of waiting. He remained himself, which meant he was still capable of being difficult and still occasionally reached for the wrong response before finding the right one, and still carried the history of everything he had done and been in 160 plus years of existing in the world without adequate moral instruction. But he was also, undeniably and increasingly, the person Elena had believed existed underneath all of that when most of the people around her had not yet been able to see it. He made choices that reflected care rather than only self-interest. He loved people, a small and specific number of them, with a consistency that had survived years of testing. He was, in the accounting of the people who knew him best, someone who had become something he had not started as, which is one of the rarer and more significant things a person can manage across any length of life. Elena became human again, eventually. The cure that had been a question and a complication and a source of conflict across years of supernatural entanglement was finally what it had always theoretically been, a choice made freely and with full understanding of what it meant. She chose mortality. She chose the particular beauty of a life that ends, the urgency that finitude creates, the human texture of time that passes and does not return. Damon chose it with her. They had a life, the kind that is not remarkable to anyone on the outside, but that is, to the people living it, more than sufficient. A house, mornings, the particular intimacy of ordinary time spent with someone you have chosen and been chosen by in return. The grief of people they had lost, carried forward and integrated into the living, rather than set aside. The ongoing and imperfect work of being good, which neither of them had ever found easy, but both of them had decided was worth attempting. On a night in spring, many years after a dark road and a bridge, and a girl with wet hair looking up at a man who had no reason to save her. Elena sat on the porch of their house in the evening and looked out at the quiet and felt the specific quality of a life that has arrived somewhere it intended to go. Damon came and sat beside her, and she leaned into him. And the night was warm and unhurried and entirely ordinary, which was in the end exactly what they had both been waiting for. So now, dear traveller, let this story settle around you like the last note of a song that has ended exactly as it should. Let the warmth of it carry you down into the quiet. Mystic falls grow still behind you. The lights go out one by one. And somewhere on a porch in the southern dark, two people who found each other on a bridge are simply, finally, at rest. Sleep now. You have travelled far enough for one night. Good night.